On a misty August morning in 1561, a young widow stepped off a galley onto Scottish soil for the first time in 13 years. She was 18 years old, fluent in French, raised at the most glittering court in Europe, and she was about to walk straight into a country that had, while she wasn't looking, changed its religion entirely. Her name was Mary, Queen of Scots, and waiting for her, quite literally within earshot of her own palace, was a preacher named John Knox, who already considered her arrival something close to a national catastrophe. This is the story of how a queen and a minister collided, not in a battlefield, but in conversation, in chapels, and in the streets of Edinburgh. Mary had been sent to France at the age of 5, betrothed to the French Dauphin Francis. She married him in 1558, and when his father died the following year, she became Queen Consort of France as well as Queen of Scots. It was a dazzling ascent. Then, in December 1560, Francis died, likely from an ear infection that spread to his brain, and 18-year-old Mary found herself a widow with no obvious place in the French court. Scotland, the kingdom she'd left as a small child, was calling her home. So, in August 1561, she set sail for Leith. The Scotland she returned to bore little resemblance to the one that she'd left. While Mary was still in France, Scotland had undergone its own religious revolution. In August 1560, a full year before her return, the Scottish Parliament, dominated by a group of Protestant nobles called the Lords of the Congregation, abolished the authority of the Pope, banned the Mass, and adopted a new statement of Protestant belief, the Scots Confession. The chief architect of this new kirk was John Knox, a former galley slave, a fierce preacher trained in Calvin's Geneva, and by 1561 the minister of St Giles in Edinburgh. Knox believed Scotland's Reformation was the will of God, not merely a political shift, and he was deeply wary of any monarchy, especially a Catholic one, who might try to undo it. So Mary arrived as a Catholic queen presiding over a Protestant parliament and a Protestant kirk, led by a preacher who had, only 3 years earlier, published a pamphlet arguing that female rulers were offensive against both nature and scripture. That pamphlet, the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, had actually been aimed at Catholic queens like Mary of Guise and Mary Tudor, but hardly made the warm welcome for Mary Stuart either. Mary didn't wait long to test the waters. Just days after arriving on Sunday, the 24th of August 1561, she had Mass celebrated in her private chapel at Holyroodhouse. Word spread fast. A crowd gathered outside, apparently intent on forcing their way in, and it was Mary's own half brother, Lord James Stuart, soon to become Earl of Moray, who stood at the chapel door and kept the peace. Knox, preaching that same week, is said to have told his congregation that a single mass frightened him more than an invading army of 10,000 men. Whether that's his exact words is hard to say. Knox recorded his own sermons, so we're relying on a source with every reason to make himself sound more eloquent. But that sentiment was genuine. To Knox, Mary's worship wasn't a personal matter. It had the potential to cause problems with the Reformation. What makes the story unusually vivid is that John Knox and Mary didn't just clash from a distance, they met several times face to face. Knox recorded these conversations in his History of the Reformation in Scotland, so everything we know about them comes filtered through his own pen, which is worth remembering. In their first recorded meeting shortly after the Mass controversy, Mary summoned Knox to answer for his preaching. They argued over whether subjects had any right to resist a ruler on grounds of religion. Knox said yes if that ruler defied God's law, a principle Mary understandably found alarming to hear from one of her own subjects. They met again over the following years, over her possible marriage to a Catholic prince, which Knox opposed loudly from the pulpit, over a sermon criticising the dancing and entertainments of her court, and once over accusations that Knox had overstepped his authority by summoning armed protesters to Edinburgh without royal permission. By Knox's own account, Mary wept with frustration in at least one of these meetings. He did not soften his position in response. Historians still argue over what to make of that. Principled conviction, plain stubbornness, or something closer to contempt for a young woman who didn't share his theology. Reasonable people land in different places on this, and it's worth saying so plainly rather than picking a side for Knox. Away from Edinburgh, the picture looked rather different. Mary travelled widely across her kingdom in these years, into Fife, the Borders, the Highlands, bringing her own household priests with her to say Mass privately wherever she stayed. Remarkably, this rarely caused the kind of unrest seen at Holyrood. Mary made no attempt to force Catholicism back onto the country at large, and by most surviving accounts, she was genuinely well received on these travels. Curious, personable, and willing to speak directly with ordinary Scots in a way that won her real goodwill, at least for a time. One small caution: most of what survives about the common people's view of Mary comes from the elite observers, ambassadors, clergymen, court officials, rather than ordinary Scots themselves. Saying she was popular on tour is a reasonable inference, but it isn't the same as hearing directly from a farmer in Fife. The peace didn't hold. In 1562, Mary moved against the powerful Catholic Gordon family in the north, culminating in the Battle of Corrichie, where the Earl of Huntly was defeated and died, and his son was later executed. Protestant Scotland cheered it as a blow against the Papists, though the conflict was arguably as much about reigning in an overmighty noble family as it was about faith. In 1565, her marriage to the Catholic leaning Lord Darnley triggered a failed rebellion by the Protestant nobles, including her own half brother, the so called Chase About Raid. Knox's sympathies, unsurprisingly, lay with the rebels. Matters came to a head in 1567. Darnley was murdered at the Kirk of Field, and Mary's swift, deeply controversial marriage to the man widely suspected of the killing, the Earl of Bothwell, proved too much for the Protestant lords to bear. They rose against her, and the two sides faced off at Carberry Hill outside Edinburgh in June 1567. In the end, there was barely a battle at all. Mary's forces melted away without a real fight, and she surrendered. She was marched back into Edinburgh under guard, jeered by hostile crowds in the street, and within days sent to imprisonment at Lochleven Castle, where she was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, James VI. Her brother Moray became regent in her place. So the Battle of Holyrood was never fought with cannon or claymore. It was fought in sermons and interviews, in private chapels and open roads. A slow contest between a Catholic queen trying to hold her throne and a Reformation that had, in many ways, already won before she ever came home. By the time the real fighting broke out at Corrichie and at Carberry Hill, the outcome had already been decided years earlier, in those tense little rooms where Mary and Knox simply talked past one another.